Clio here, welcome to my channel, and today I'm doing the literary fiction book tag by Jasmine from Jasmine's Reads. So I will link the original video down below. This is a video, it's a book tag that's quite recent. It was created in July, and I also referred to it in my favorite booktube videos for the month of July video, which I will also link down below in case you want to see it. But quite a lot of other people have also done the literary book tag by now, so if you want some further answers to these questions, definitely look it up in the search bar for YouTube and you can watch some more of these videos. Now the first question is immediately maybe the question you ask yourself if you're not that familiar with literary fiction, and that is what is literary fiction? Now sadly there's no clear-cut answer for this question. So literary fiction kind of defies definition. So first of all, what I would say is it's usually difficult to put a genre on it. So literary fiction itself is not a genre, and books of literary fiction are usually difficult to place in one genre or another. Some of them might be easier to place, and often that's then called hybrid genre literary fiction. So for example, you could have a hybrid dystopia literary fiction, which I will come back to later in the video. But pure literary fiction is often difficult, often if you use strict genre specifications, you could probably place these books in contemporary, but contemporary definitely doesn't carry the load of literary fiction work, if I think about what a contemporary is, I usually won't be thinking about a work of literary fiction. So literary fiction in a way transcends genres. So in that sense I would say if you read something you find it difficult to decide what is this book, if you're yeah, it's a little bit of a thriller, but I wouldn't really say it's a thriller per se, then it has a possibility of being maybe a work of literary fiction. Second thing that is important if you want to say that a work is a work of literary fiction is an emphasis on language. So it's an emphasis on the craft. This can either be a very big emphasis on the way that a work is structured, or for example a use of experimental language or anything like that, or a reflection on language and the power of language or the power of literature as a whole. So for example, metafiction has which is fiction which reflects on language itself, on the format of the novel itself, has a good shot of being literary fiction, though not all metafiction is literary fiction neither. Then a third part that is important in the creation of a third part that is important in labeling something as literary fiction is a emphasis on the human condition. So a literary work is always something that is a reflection on the human condition. And this is very vague, of course, and this can be done more prominently in some works of literary fiction than in others. Overall, I would say a literary fiction work is less, the emphasis is less on the plot, more on a sort of reflection on human condition, and it defies genre specification. Second question is to name a fiction book which has a brilliant character study. Now, of course, for all of these questions, a lot of books come to mind. The one that I will be discussing is one that I read quite recently, because then I feel that I'm more able to talk about it, and that is Colorless, Tsukuru, Tazaki by why do I want to say Hayao Miyazaki? It's Haruki Murakami. Now Haruki Murakami is more or less a he usually does the hybrid of come up with it, magical realism, branching into literary fiction. This one is not a magical realism work. It is more a contemporary literary fiction. So in this book we are following Tsukuru Tazaki, who is our title character. The reason why he calls himself Colorless is because in high school he was very much part of a group of people who all had colors in their last names, and he also considered them to be very colorful characters, people who stood out, who grabbed attention. And he considers himself very much more as flying under the radar, as he's very introverted, he keeps to himself a lot, and he considers himself as the weaker part of the group. He states in his book that if any member of this group was going to be left out, then it was going to be him. And this is also what happens at some point. So he returns from university at some point, and his friends shy away from him. He asks them for an explanation, but one of them says yeah, you know what happens. And he kind of accepts that, because in a way he's so because he's very self-conscious and he's very doubtful about himself, and so as he's been describing himself as colorless, he definitely feels like, sure, they finally realized that I'm not really contributing anything to the group, and so he leaves it as it is. Decades later, when he starts to like go out with a certain person in his life, she kind of makes him see that he definitely needs closure on this aspect of his life, and so he goes back to to his childhood home to kind of try and figure out what happened back then, why was he left out of this group. And so I think this is a very wonderful character description in which we like get a very close look into the life of and the mind of Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki, which for me was a very it was a very moving character description, and I think it's one of my favorite Murakami's at the moment. I thought I really liked Murakami because of his like magical realism and the bizarreness of his stories, but I actually loved Tsukuru Tazaki more than I loved some of his more out there books. So it's a book that's actually flying under the radar in terms of Murakami's work, but I definitely would recommend it. And if you haven't read any Murakami and you're like not really that into magical realism, maybe give this one a go instead. Next question is to name a literary fiction novel that has unique writing or experimental writing. So this is something that, as I've described, as I've said, that like a big part of literary fiction is an emphasis on the craft. There's a lot of examples of experimental writing or unique writing to be found in literary fiction. There are some different possibilities that come to mind. I could have gone for Lani, which uses a very fluid, like almost poetic format to its writing. There's the more like stream of consciousness writing that happens, for example, in Milkman by Anna Burns, or in Lucy Ellmann's Ducks Newbury Report, which I haven't read yet, but I heard it said that that is the case. But what I'm going for is a metafiction. So I really love metafiction in which the writer is kind of reflecting on the act of writing, for example, or in which a frame story is used in order to reflect on storytelling as a whole. The one that I'm referring to, the one that I will be promoting, the one that I will be promoting is If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. This is one of my favorite novels, and it's really a weird one, so I find it very difficult to recommend this book to people, because I know that so many people, that it's not a book for so many people. But if you like weird writing, if you like metafiction, if you like the meta levels, so if you like books reflecting on themselves, book reflecting on writing as a whole, then If on a Winter's Night a Traveler might be for you. So in If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which I'm finding very difficult to say apparently, is divided in 8 parts, and every one of these parts seems to be a different story. I mean, the story is never finished. And so we're kind of left with this very chaotic mess. But it's very much becoming a reflection on story writing and on writing as a whole. Also, a lot of the times the reader will be addressed directly in this book, which is something that I very much love. I love this book. It's been so long, well, it's not been so long since I read it, but probably at this point it's like 6 years or so, maybe even. So I definitely want to reread this one and rediscover my love for it, hopefully. Next up is name a fiction book that has an interesting structure. So as I said before, with the craft being such an important part of literary fiction, so you will have a lot of books with unique writing, but you will also have a lot of books with unique structure. One that I'm choosing is one that I read recently, and that is The Overstory by Richard Powers. So far, my favorite book of the year. The Overstory by Richard Powers is a book about trees. It's about people and their love for trees and their wish to help preserve trees, about the danger in which trees are, and like the difficulty we have of stopping the lumber industry. It's very much a important book for these times in that sense. As you can see, we have like a lot of parts of the trees on the book here, and that is also how the book is structured. So the book is structured according to the parts of the tree. So the first part of the book is the roots, and in this we are introduced to the different characters who will form part of our main story, which is the trunk. So the in the roots part we get these disparate stories, almost like a short story collection. Then in the roots part we're getting interactions between these characters. They are becoming part of an overarching story, the story about tree activism. And then at some point we are reaching the crown, so we are branching out. So this might mean that certain characters are branching out together, maybe even eventually to branch out altogether, and then certain other other people are branching out in another cluster of their own, and so branching out furthermore and furthermore. And then the final part, which is a part that I must say myself that either I don't feel is executed very well or that I just didn't get, is the seeds part, because I would assume the seeds part to be like seeds being laid for future generations or something like that, and I don't think that that is what's happening in the seed part. So if you've read the Overstory by Richard Powers, definitely help me out here down below if you have an interpretation for the seeds part, or like if you also found that to be somewhat unclear. But so yeah, the Overstory by Richard Powers, interesting structure, wonderful book. I will say it's not for everybody. I mean, it has a very clear message about, you know, environmentalism, so if you're not into that, then definitely shy away from this one. Next, name a literary fiction work that discusses social themes. I had a difficult time with this one just because it's so broad of a question that like almost every work of literary fiction will apply. Like I said, one of the main reasons for calling something literary fiction is because it has something to say about the human condition, which most likely will lead you somewhere down social themes. I decided to go with one in which like social themes is very much on the forefront, and that is The Master and Margarita by Mikhael Bulgakov. This will usually be classified as a classic, but classics is also not a genre, and you can be a classic and a literary fiction. Definitely, since this is not a classic but a modern classic, so it's actually modern classic is like basically something that is also fabricated. It's something that we expect to become a classic at some point, and in my opinion works of literary fiction have more chance of becoming a classic, so this one is already halfway there. So The Master and Margarita by Mikhael Bulgakov is probably the closest thing I can think of to a fantasy literary fiction hybrid. So it's a very weird story. It's very it's very disorienting at times. It's difficult to get through at times because there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme and reason to the story. It's very much a commentary on communist Russia. So at some point in Russian history, the devil lands in Moscow and brings chaos to the city. And so, yeah, the premise is already very weird. And so a lot of things start happening. There's like a lot of magic involved. A lot of people are ending up in a madhouse because of the devil's actions here. And it's very much a commentary on like Moscow society at the time, on the way that people are getting ahead in life in this society, and the sort of hypocrisy that comes with that. It's very weird, it's very disorienting. I loved it. I don't think I don't think I grasped it fully. You know, you need a lot of background on communist Russia in order to grasp every single thing that this book is commentating on. But even if you don't have a full grasp of communist Russia, I think it's a very interesting book to read. But I will say that I read it in book club with 4 other people. And the 4 other people really didn't like this book at all, but it has a very good rating on Goodreads. Other people agree with me on this one. Next up is another very general question. Name a literary fiction book which has something to say about human conditions, so basically any literary fiction work. Alright, so one in which I think that this is very much at the foreground is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I think a lot of people who like literary fiction actually don't like this one, and a lot of people who don't like literary fiction do like this one, because I've seen a lot of criticism of this work actually by people who are into literary fiction. I myself have read it like quite a long time ago, so I don't really have that much of a grasp of like, I know I liked it at the time, but would I still like it now? So I definitely am due for a reread. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro is a book in which we follow 3 people who are in a boarding school setting in the UK, but they're not your typical teens, they are actually clones. And as you can imagine, this book is very much an exploration then of like what it means to be human and the value of clones, for example, and these types of ethical questions as well. I think Never Let Me Go is probably like a very good book for you to figure out the difference between genre fiction and literary fiction. Like premise-wise, it sounds like it's sci-fi, but if you read it, you will understand why I say that it's difficult to label it sci-fi after having read it. So if you want a good one to understand the difference between genre fiction and literary fiction, I think this one definitely works very well. Then the next question is to name one of your favorite hybrid genre literary fiction. Now, there are obviously a lot of hybrid genre literary fiction, so I just introduced you to sci-fi literary fiction. I think Master and Margarita is the closest things to a fantasy literary fiction that I've read. I will give you 3 examples for a genre that I really like, a genre hybrid literary fiction, and that is dystopian literary fiction. I think most of the dystopians that I've read are either YA dystopians way back in the day, or they are literary fiction dystopians, because the genre just lends itself very well, it seems, to the literary fiction genre. The first one is one that I actually physically own, and that is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It's very much actual at this moment because the sequel has just come out. I would urge you not to read it. The Handmaid's Tale, however, is definitely one that I will recommend, and I really think you should go for it because it's a very interesting read. I think I like dystopia a lot because it takes a look at the way in which our society is evolving, taking that to extremes and showing like the danger that is present in certain things in our society at the moment. And so even though The Handmaid's Tale was written in the 80s, it's still very much accurate at this point in time. You know, it's still something very much of our time, a very important book for our times. And this is looking at a society in which our rights are restricted, and most importantly, female rights are restricted. All agency is taken away from most females. Some females still have some agency, and actually the perspective of one of those is explored in the Testaments, and it's actually the only thing about the Testaments that I found interesting. So in The Handmaid's Tale, like basically all of like our female rights and everything that female rights activists have achieved in over the last decades have basically been reversed. Like females no longer have property or money or anything like that. It is all in the hands of their male next of kin or of their of their husband. Females are very much reduced to the kitchen again, or to their reproductive functions, which is what is being used in this in these girls known as handmaidens. And so it's very much a commentary on on how easy it could actually be to restrict these powers again. But so a very interesting book, definitely one that I think all feminists should be reading, because it's just looking at some very interesting and scary possibilities out there, but these are all just things that have really happened in the past, in other places in the world. This is why Margaret Atwood doesn't like calling it dystopia. She calls it speculative fiction, but I think all dystopia is just speculative fiction, because we mainly take our inspiration from what is actually happening in the world. We might be giving it somewhat of a futuristic twist, and we might be imagining some parts of it, but usually you will find some sort of a inspiration, at least, in what is happening in the real world. I don't think that was very eloquently put by me, but so yeah. Second book in this genre that I would like to promote is The Wall by John Lanchester. So I just read this because it's nominated it's on the long list for the Booker Prize. It didn't make it onto the short list, though I think it could have. It's definitely worth more than The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. So The Wall by John Lanchester is very much similar to The Handmaid's Tale in a way. It's also looking at a society in which it is difficult to get children. It is looking at environmental issues. The environmental issues are very much at the background of The Handmaid's Tale and very much more to the foreground of The Wall. So in The Wall, we are in the UK, sometime in the future, which isn't specified. Throughout the book we discover that it's like a UK that is isolating itself from the outside world because sea levels have risen, and there are a lot of climate refugees. And so they've built a wall to kind of keep the others out. And so it's very much an exploration into what it means, into like human nature and like our tendency to make it sort of an us-them story, and then trying to and then gradually throughout the story the us becomes the them, and like so you're starting to see that there was never really an us-them, there were just people on this side of the wall and people on that side of the wall. Very interesting book. I think it does, like, the final part was necessary, but I think it wasn't executed as well, or it wasn't executed the way that I would have liked it, which resulted in kind of me not really clicking that well with the final part of the novel. But overall I thought it was a very interesting look at like what might be in store if we are not able to reverse the effects of global warming. It also very much looks into like the discrepancy between generations, between the generation that could have stopped it and the generation that comes after. Third book in this hybrid genre that I want to talk about is Blindness by José Saramago. So this is a Portuguese novel, and in this one we are following a couple of which the man woke up one morning and he was blind. And so there's no medical explanation for why he has suddenly gone blind, and it turns out that there are more individuals throughout the city who have gone blind from one moment into the next. So the government's answer to this, of course, is to isolate these people because they want to find out what is going on. And so this couple is taken to this institution. The wife pretends to be blind as well in order to be able to go with her husband. And we see kind of what the going on in this institute through her eyes. Now, even though the government wants to figure out what is happening, they're also very fearful of what is happening, and and so they kind of like treat these, and so you kind of get this sort of ghetto inside the institute, which the outside forces not being willing to go inside and keep order, and so you get like a new power structure within this institute, which is very interesting. Some horrible things happening there as well. If you've seen the movie, you know that the book is way more powerful, and that certain scenes which have been implicit in the book become very explicit in the movie. Other way around. Certain scenes that were very implicit in the movie, because of ratings, I guess, they wanted to keep it PG, I guess, this becomes very explicit in the book. And then the final question. So the final question is to name the type of hybrid genre literary fiction you would like to see more, and I guess that would be fantasy for me. So I read mostly literary fiction and fantasy. It's like 40-40, and then like 20% other stuff. And so I would like to see more fantasy literary fiction. I must say that I think Master and Margarita is a fantasy literary fiction, but apart from that I cannot really imagine what a fantasy literary fiction would look like. Anything that I come up with is actually magical realism literary fiction. So I would definitely like to see more fantasy literary fiction. I think there are some literary fiction elements to certain books. Certain fantasy books have elements that could make it literary fiction, but not all the way. So for example, The Name of the Wind is the fantasy book that has gotten closer to it, in the sense that it does have that emphasis on language, but I don't think it steers away from the genre classification enough. You know, it's still clearly a fantasy. There's no doubt about it. It's not like it's steering away from the typical ways in which a fantasy story develops. So it is still very much fantasy, not literary fiction. I think I have to reread this book, but maybe The Chimes is a fantasy literary fiction, because I was rereading the synopsis to see whether I could use it for an answer for any of these questions, and then I was like, maybe this would classify as fantasy literary fiction, but I would have to reread it for that. So definitely let me know down below if you have any fantasy literary fiction that you can recommend to me, or any other literary fiction. I mean, I've read a few, but definitely there are a whole lot of them out there that I haven't read. This tag is going around, so definitely check out like the search bar in YouTube as well if you want to see more of these videos. videos. I absolutely had a great time looking into my answers for this tag, because it really made me go back through like the literary fiction works that I had read, and really made me see that a lot of them I really want to reread, because yeah, a lot of these are from like my university days, for example, and I don't really have a good memory. So also, for example, one that I've been saying I want to reread for such a long time is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, because I read that in high school and I really loved it, but I don't remember anything about it except that it was set in the desert at some point or something like that, so I really need to reread that one. But so yeah, definitely let me know down below if you have any recommendations for me, what your favorite book of literary fiction is, if you have a favorite in terms of like genre hybrids, and yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!